You also can't control who's a member of those 80 security groups. Oftentimes, you're not able to even see who's inside of those security groups, depending on how your organization runs things. Because if they're not email enabled, you won't be able to put it into Outlook and click on the little plus sign and see who all is a member. AD team might not update it very quickly. I've got a coworker who's been on site with the client for 5 weeks, and he needs to wait yet another 2 more weeks before he has an account. So if you don't run into stuff like that, I guarantee you it's because you're working in the private sector. In the government space, because of security and paperwork and everything else, it can take a long while. So he has certain accounts that he can use, but not others. Those 80 security groups might not be email enabled. So if you want to email a particular group, you know, you can email your permission groups, but if they're filled with 80 security groups that are not email enabled, they're not going to receive them. To me, it's not granular enough. There are often times where I'll create a group that might have only 1 person in it. But I create that group because whenever that person leaves that job, I want to only replace it with the person's relief and not have to go update 40 sites where that group might have access. I'd rather update the group's membership and leave it alone. You've got 3 ways of really looking at your access control. Primarily, role-based access control, RBAC. So here has Security Plus. Anybody? Anybody? Yay, 1. Okay, so you, going through Security Plus books and whatnot, know probably all about role-based access control. Unfortunately, most of the people I've met who are thrown into being a SharePoint person have no clue what role-based access control is. So think of it as like job titles, right? You have people who have access to the company credit card to get supplies from Staples. And you probably have 1 or 2 of these folks in each of the offices, maybe 100 total in an organization, but they're dispersed all throughout. You can have one group, one SharePoint permission group with all those people in it, and that way you're not in the silos of an organizational structure. You're looking at the role that they fill. Okay? All the SharePoint people, right? We want them to be able to have a certain level of access regardless of what organization they work for. You know, you might control your SharePoint people centrally and then they go out and help other people. They might be dispersed and they have clients that they help locally and then get together for other things. But if you look at those roles that they're filling and you grant those roles permissions, that's the better way to do it. You've got organizational-based access control and you've got location-based access control. And we'll go through this. So organizational, it's a traditional way that I see most people thinking, because they normally make new sites for every sub-office in an agency, organization, company, etc. And so they think, okay, all of CIO people, all of the CFO people, all of the marketing people, all the whoever we're talking about, right? And in many situations, that's going to be good, but by no means is that really, really good. Okay, and by that I mean, my last client, I won't talk about my current client, but my last client had about 800 people in the CIO's office, right? So if I created the CIO's site, who all is a member of CIO members? That's like 800 people, okay? By default, who gets access to site pages? CIO members, right? So do you really want to have 800 people who can alter the landing page of the CIO's site? I would suggest not, right? So you have to think about that. Whenever we look at these organizations, when you create any site traditionally inside of SharePoint, it automatically creates that owners group and a visitors group. When you think about organizations, there's no real owner to that. Okay, it's not no one owns the CIO except for the CIO, and I'd highly recommend that you don't put the CIO as the person who has full control, because he or she should have other responsibilities to take care of rather than building the site. Your visitors group, are they really CIO visitors, or are they just like, hey, everybody else in the company, right? Because since Microsoft got rid of forward, web, internet-facing sites, we don't have anonymous access to this stuff in Office 365 and whatnot anymore. We have to think about, it's mainly an intranet, right? So your visitors group is probably what you're going to fill with everyone. So how often have you gone into an environment and you see a dozen different visitor groups out there, and every one of them has everyone as a member of that visitors group? That's kind of redundant. And now you're expanding the scope of your management burden when it's not really necessary. So typically when I create a site collection, I create that visitors group that's automatic, and I just change the name of it immediately to everybody in the organization. Give it some other name, something like that, right? And I always change that owners group, that default owners group, to site administrators, because everybody who's a GS14 or above, or people who run that office, I'm in charge here, right? They think of themselves as owners. But really, you don't want to give those of management who have the least technical skills among us full control. And it's a bad idea for all kinds of reasons. Least of which is if you have full control, now you have a lot of other things you can click on. Whenever you have a lot of things to click on, it's kind of like getting the menu from the Cheesecake Factory. It takes a while, and you're going to start clicking on all kinds of things you don't really want to have access to. By keeping people scoped down to the permissions that they're supposed to have, it's going to make their user experience a whole lot nicer. Location-based access control. I don't usually permission off a lot of things based on location, but I might audience a lot of things based on location. My last client had folks all over the world. We had folks in McLean, we had folks in DC, we had folks in Annapolis, we had folks all over the place, right? So if you have news that's dependent on your location, weather, all kinds of stuff, you can audience a web part to those groups, and that way when you're sending out news feeds to say, hey, bathrooms flooded in this building and whatever, it's only going to reach those people who it should really reach, and it doesn't get in the way of everybody else's experience on the site.
So today we had somebody was using audience targeting, and they said they had a different experience in Office 365 than in on-premise. That it doesn't really target the way it should. And I haven't come across that yet, and I was wondering if you had seen it.
I've played a lot in 365, and I have not had a problem with it working any differently than it worked for me whenever I was on premises. So maybe they just didn't have it configured very well.
Right.
I wish there was a way to audience things so it would be, the negative, right? I don't want these people to see it. Instead, everything is in the positive. And that's another thing to remember, right? You'll find sometimes you open up and you look at the permissions, and some group has gotten full control, design, edit, contribute, read, and restricted read, or something like that. I'm like, that's kind of redundant, I've seen like contribute, no delete, special, permission level created, given to the same group that already has contribute. And I'm like, what purpose does this serve? Because it's going to, the overriding access is going to be the greater level of access. So you don't want to do that. If you're going to assign a permission level, you want to assign one permission level. My only exception on that happens to be on approve. If you've got the approve, it's for content approval and other things, and you can set it up so that only those people can run a workflow while not others, and doesn't really give them any extra access to things. So sometimes you might want to add approve. So some role-based access control examples, right? So these are roles that people are filling, right? The site administrators, knowledge managers, right? They could be in different branches, divisions, etc., but they all make up one group for the larger organization. Project members, right? Because your project might be matrixed throughout an organization where you're picking people from different, sub-offices of your organization to make up one team. The contractors, right? You might want to segregate all of your contractors into a group, and all the government people into a group, and all of your military people into another group. Hopefully you use Active Directory to some extent with some of that, because those tend to get to be very, very large groups. Naturally, I would say that if your SharePoint permission group has 40, 50 people or more, I would hope that you get an Active Directory group, because it just gets a little too cumbersome to manage. Anytime you have to page over like 5, 6 times to get to all of the members, it's overkill, right? You should never have to do that. You have the different authorized purchasers, supply people, leadership. So that's another thing, right? Your leaders, your management inside of your organization, right? They want it to be, in the owners group. Well, we've already renamed that to the site administrators group. And the way to give them the proper warm and fuzzy is to create a leadership group, throw them in there, and it gives them a warm and fuzzy that they have access to stuff. And while they might only have read access, they've got access to everything that they need to have, the right level of access. Don't call it management. They like the warm and fuzzy from leadership a little bit more. So it's semantics, but it matters. Words matter. Organizationally based access control examples. So these are like the smaller teams inside of a CIO's office. Your Active Directory admins, your SharePoint admins, storage admin team, those teams that are there, you can put those people in them. Your help desk folks, your et cetera, right? And then the all company, all agency. So really, I would never have a visitors group, right? Because I'm going to have my all company. I would never have another need for a visitors group. If someone is coming to my site, I should already know who they are. They should already belong to a group of some kind that I can associate. I shouldn't be like everyone else, right? I already got that group. I don't need to create it 5, 8 times. I would never have a separate owners group. I would always have site administrator groups. I always rename it. It's probably one of the worst things that Microsoft did was to default these names the way that they did, because everyone thinks, well, I own the data, and so they get misconception that they should be put into that group where it would have full control by default. So when you're creating all of those sites in the future, you should never let SharePoint create those groups for you. Before you ever create a site, a list, a library, you should already know who's going to be needing access to it. You should have already created those groups long before you ever created that site, list, or library. Hellback examples. Like I was saying, the different sites that you might have, you create those folks in there, and that way you can use it for audiencing primarily. You might use it for different workflows where you're going to email certain locations differently, because based on their time zone, their stuff might go down, for maintenance compared to other people. So, key point, make the groups before you make the sites. I can't stress this enough, right? Everything you ever build, not even thinking about the permissions here, right? Everything that you ever build, you should know what it is before you build it, okay? Don't design your list while you're building it. Design your list on paper, have it all figured out on paper, and then go click, 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 done. And no list should take you more than an hour to create, because you've already done this on paper. You've already figured out who's going to have what level of access to that thing. And because you're giving the access to the different roles, and then you have people assigned to those roles. So if you're doing this properly, and you have given roles, different levels of access to all of your sites, lists, and libraries, broken inheritance wherever necessary, whenever it comes time, Jim Bob just joined the office, right? Well, I should know, well, Jim Bob is going to be a member of this organization. Well, what's your job title? Okay, he's a member of this role and this role. At no point in the future should anyone ever have to come to me and say, hey, can you give Jim Bob access to this site? Because Jim Bob should already have access to whatever sites, lists, and libraries he needs, because he's already been put into those roles he's filling. So it drives me nuts whenever I see people who've already put their email address in there so that they get emailed when someone wants access, because that should never even come up as a question. You as a SharePoint person shouldn't even be the one who's monitoring who gets access. You should not be part of the in and out processing chain, right? So I have groups that are, not all groups are used to secure content, okay? So this one will blow your mind, right? All permission groups should be owned by another group, right? By default, it's going to be assigned to whoever's creating the group. Always give it to another group. Well, I don't want to have the administrative burden of onboarding and offboarding people to the organization. I'm too busy building solutions. So if you have administrative, secretarial type staff in all these branches and the divisions and whatnot of a large organization, they know who works there. Why don't you give them that control? You don't have to give them full control to the site. You don't have to give them any other kind of access. You create a permission group, you give it no permissions. You put the secretarial staff inside of there, and then you say, you guys have the role of adding people to and from your organization. So for CIO, I would say, I have a CIO membership management group. And I would put those 2 or 3 people in there, and as people came and went from the organization, they would go to that permission group and add and remove people. They've got no extra permissions, they're not going to be building lists and libraries, but they are the ones who are managing that access, because they should know who's a member of the office a whole lot better than you, and you should be busy building solutions, not, having some empire where you're managing in and out processing. I also love to make an administrative site. This will blow your mind, okay? If you're fortunate, you've got a company who has paid for you to have control point. Okay, so you can get all these special tools to help you manage permissions and stuff. And it's a wonderful thing. But not always will you be that fortunate. So I tend to create a subsite where I've given no permission group, any level of access. I, as a site collection admin, will still see this. No one else does. This is so that people can't navigate through the little trick that I do. I create then a subsite to it where I've given every permission group that I have read access. That way, whenever Jim Bob has joined the organization, I go to the permission settings and I say, check permissions. They say Jim Bob needs to have Joe Bob's permissions. Everything that Joe Bob has access to, give Jim Bob access. Okay, search for what all access does Joe Bob have. He's a member of CIO members, he's a member of this, he's a member of that, he's a member of that. Okay, so these 4 groups. I open up the 4 groups, I add Jim Bob to those 4 groups. That way I don't have to go site to site to site and add this guy to all those different places where that permission group may or may not exist, because if you have 50 sites, you might not remember where all of the permission groups are used. But if you put all those permission groups onto one subsite where you've just given it read access, it's got nothing else really on there, you can do that check access, find out what access this person has, stick the other person, the new person right in there. Makes it a whole lot easier to manage all your stuff. And then from there, you can create pages to help with the rest of your administration of SharePoint and how you're doing things. But does anyone not understand what I just talked about right there? Because that is a weird concept for some folks.
It's something new for me.
It's new, but I'll tell you, it works. It works well. I use it a lot. The thing is that if you go and you look at the permission groups of any site collection, right? You groups ISPX and you look at all of them. If you have like 180 groups, you're wrong to begin with. Okay. I guess in an extremely large organization, you might get to something like that. But if you're looking at, say you have 12 divisions, 5 branches under each, right? You know, that would be 60 groups right there. Membership manager groups for all of them. Now you're looking at 120. You know, it can grow, but very often you're not going to see anything like 180 groups. But I'll come to some sites where, I kid you not, I'm working on one right now that I just migrated for somebody. They have 31 people in the site collection. They have 115 groups. Someone messed up. And the main thing is that they have 40 different visitor groups, 40 different owner groups, and every one of those owner groups has mostly the same people. All the visitor groups had the exact same, you know, everywhere NT Authority, all authenticated users. So you can eliminate all that redundancy. You're not going to be managing that many groups when you work on the sub-site and you're doing it right.
Do you keep a separate template file or like a template list or a template library without those groups as a part of it that you can load up faster? Or do you make the list your library and then delete, or make the site and then delete the visitor groups?
I have all the permission groups I ever need before I ever create the site. So when it says, who do you want to be your default, you know, owners, whatever, I just grab the site administrators group that's going to be that site administrators group, and I stick it in there.
Okay.
That visitor group, I use that, the site collections visitor group that has everybody in it, and I put it in there, okay? And that's just how you do it,
Okay.
okay? Boop, boop, boop. I love this picture. I think it was Hill Malik who posted this a long time ago. If you can't see it, it's the modern UI. I just find it funny, so I had it in there. So other organizational based control, access control groups, blah, blah, blah. Let's close this out. There's my site, Excel, click. I'm going to show you all something. So if you go to, you're not going to see that. I am presenting from this screen. So let me, that's my babies.
We're seeing the spreadsheet now.
Yeah, I am, but you're not seeing it up there.
No, Skype is.
Yeah. Duplicate. Am I still presenting?
No.
No. Okay, so everyone sees everything? It's very bright screen, isn't it? How's the zoom level look for you? Good? Okay, so if you go to the site, my blog, you'll find a link somewhere down there for a copy of this workbook that I used. The reason why I say go ahead and use it, don't necessarily make your own, is because I've done all kinds of data validation on here, so you can use all kinds of drop downs for useful purposes. So I will have a master list where I'm tracking all of the permission groups I'm going to use, because I plan before I build, right? So I create this long list and I say, who's the owner of all these different groups? So I've got that membership managers group, wherever it needs to be, okay? I have defined already who can view the membership. Unless you are the SharePoint farm administrator, site collection administrator for the Freemasons, there is no reason why it should not say everyone of who can see the group, okay? Can anyone tell me some issues that come up whenever you say members only?
Nobody else can see.
Yeah, but Why is that a problem?
Because
People,
then we don't know who has access to it and who doesn't, and if the guy leaves, it's a big issue.
That can be a part of the problem.
people can get suspicious of your activities and start blaming you for certain things, like hiding information from the public or from the company.
Yeah, it does look a little shady, you know, hiding the sausage making. But the main one that I run into, workflows. I am testing something. I am a site collection admin. I can see everything. So I'm creating a workflow for somebody. I'm on their site. They built it 3 years ago. They came, you know, hey, Scott, we need you to come in and build a workflow for this. Okay, no problem. I go there, I see the groups that they're using, okay, blah, 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 I start creating the workflow, I got emails going out and everything. I'm testing, it functions. I'm a site collection admin. I can see the membership. Someone else goes to run the workflow. They aren't site collection admins. They can't see the membership. Email does not get sent. Permission groups do not get changed whenever you're trying to do different, you know, things. So that's the biggest problem. That those automated emails that should go out with workflow all of a sudden break, and you're like, well, it worked for me, and you don't realize it until you open up the permission groups, and then you go and change it so that everybody can see it. It's the only way that workflow is going to run, unless you run everything in your workflow underneath an impersonation step, but that would be crazy. Who can edit the membership? 90% of the time, it's probably going to be the owners group that you're putting on there. If you have a lot of fast-moving, you know, project teams and things like that, you might want to make the project team able to add and remove people if it's something that moves very, very quickly.
But
Otherwise,
more than one owners.
What's that?
You want to have more than one owners in case.
Well, yeah,
otherwise-
it's whoever's in the owners group. So, but it's whenever you have these permission groups that you've created, it's either the owners group or members of that group. So you could have 20 people in a group. Now all of a sudden, 20 people have the ability to add and remove people. I'll tell you, bad things can happen. You know, I've also often gotten the whole thing of, well, the GS15 who's in charge, he needs to be in that owners group because, you know, it's his office and he owns all that stuff. And I'm like, well, General Stewart outranks him. Can I put him into the owners group as well? Oh, no. He outranks your boss. And you're saying no? Why? Your logic is flawed, okay? Create those leadership groups. Give them read access where they need read access. As soon as you explain it to them, like, hey, you really don't want to see all of the back end of this because it doesn't apply to you. You only want to see the stuff that you want to see, and so we're giving you the right level of access. We're not denying you the ability to read any libraries out there. We just don't want you breaking your own sites, or because I've seen a number of, you know, people with rank break their own stuff. Seen it quite a lot. So you have sites all throughout your environment. I will go through and I will list every single list in the library that I have. Let's zoom like on there, Mike. Is that awful for everybody?
It's okay.
So I will list all of the different lists and libraries and everything else, right? And I will say, go click, up here, it's pulling from the other worksheet of all my possible permission groups that I've created. Okay? So I will come in here and I will say, yeah, click. I will populate this across the board of all the different groups that I think that will need some level of access, any level of access, okay? And then I create this little matrix to say, hey, these people need this level of access throughout, right? Okay? I will do whatever I have to do in order to make that work right. Okay? So you're going to create this matrix of who gets what level of access. And it's very important that you do this because I guarantee you that if you're not breaking inheritance at least a couple places on every site that you ever create, you're setting yourself up for danger. Your site pages and your pages libraries, if they have contribute, given to 400 people, bad things are going to happen. I once did some side work for Freddie Mac. Their SharePoint Center of Excellence team that was very offended by the fact that another company had hired me to come in there in the first place had a site, and they supposedly had governance on there, so I was looking for a document. Apparently it was actually a list. So I go and I'm looking for this stuff, and I don't have an account yet. I actually have a guy that had hired me. I'm like, hey, can we look for their governance? So he's a completely different organization, completely divorced. And I'm looking at this, and it just, oh my gosh, right? Top right corner. What do you think I saw? Edit. SharePoint Center of Excellence. I can see edit. And I'm in a completely divorced organization. So you know what I did? Barney. I love to put Barney on websites because I love you. You love me. So yeah, I play with the website just a little bit and then change it back just to prove the point. Because I love it whenever people get like all offended that I'm there. I'm like, y'all are paying me for a reason because y'all suck. So anyway, so you're going to want to break inheritance more than likely at your site pages and your pages library, so that not everyone can get, contribute rights. Okay, bring down, other people get read. Okay, you're probably going to have some other stuff on here like, I don't have it typed in here, site assets, right? Okay, you're going to want to put site asset stuff in there, so you have your script that renders things properly and all of the JavaScript and everything else, right? You're going to want to put that site assets, maybe. Personally, I like to create a scripts library, and then I hide it through SharePoint Disaster so that people don't know how to just navigate to it and look at all my code. But I do that. The thing is that, say you do want people to be able to upload things because they are creating wikis and stuff like that. Create new site assets types libraries. When you go and you create a new library, you can say, hey, do I want this to be a site assets library or not? That way when you're loading up content through a wiki, it'll say, where do you want to stick this? And it's only going to pick asset libraries to begin with. So you can just create new ones that are very specific to that, right? So if you have a wiki library, the assets library that goes to it should probably have the exact same permissions, just saying. Your site assets library, I would say, should probably have a lot more people with reading and far fewer people with contributing. Okay? Now I've got one here for divisions and branches and things like this. This is because you're probably going to have all kinds of lists throughout your environment that you're going to use for lookup purposes. Okay? The last client happened to have forgive them, they use an announcements list to create this thing. Anyway, it had like 57,000 items in it for what they were doing. And they had a lookup column that was pulling from another list for the organizations to say who their customers were. For whatever reason, they did not change the level of access that all of the customers had when they were putting in their requests. And somehow, some knucklehead got to that list and deleted his organization. It was being used as a lookup. So like 10,000 objects were suddenly without the lookup to that organization. Okay, I was off this thing. So lady who worked there was like, oh no, that office is missing. Here, let me add that back. Okay? You think that worked? No, because lookups go to the ID value, not that text value that's there. So I show up the next day and they're like, Scott, help, help. And I take a look and I'm like, oh, delete, or actually I didn't delete it yet. I went into a recycle bin, I undeleted the item that they had removed, and then I deleted the new one that she had just created, and ta-da, everything's back to normal.
And that took you like 12 hours, right?
Huh?
It took you like 12 hours to
5 minutes. Usually most of the times when I see things, it's like, oh, and everyone thinks I'm a god. No, it's been around a lot longer. I've seen this stuff. So it was relatively easy for me to fix, and hey, I'm a hero. So it's a boost to my confidence. But anyway, you're going to break the inheritance on a lot of different things, for good reason. A lot of people are averse to breaking inheritance because they're like, well, it's going to affect performance. Unless your laptop was built in 2003, not really. And the number of inheritance breaks that you can have in a site collection, I think, is like 50,000 or something like that now. So if you come close to 50,000, let me know. I'd love to see how the performance is, but more than likely, you're not going to have a big issue. Okay? Use the inheritance breaks properly. Now, when you go look at all site contents and you see all that stuff there, it doesn't say what the permissions are. Right? This is also why you do up this list and stuff inside of this workbook, because you're not using the workbook to say what the permissions are. You're doing it to say what the permissions should be, because I guarantee you, you're going to give some knucklehead full control who probably should not have had it, but your boss said give it to him anyway. And that numbskull is going to go click inherit permissions from the parent. And it's going to break all the beauty that you had just created. So you open up your workbook and you go click, 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 and fix it. Okay? If you're not documenting what the design should be before you build, you're wrong. Build this, stick it in a wiki. I have solution wikis on all the sites that I've ever created where I document everything I'm building, why it's built that way, permission architecture, all that good stuff, and I paste it there. Or I drop the workbook and everything else inside of it so that I can keep track of all this. Because someone is going to break your permissions months after you've created it, and you're not going to remember what it's supposed to be because you did it in your head, right? You're going to want to have all this documented so it's easy to go back. Now, whenever you do these, right, say I'm the CIO's office. I've got this site, and I have all my stuff all situated, all the right people in CIO can see what they're supposed to see and contribute where they're supposed to contribute. But now I've got this library where the CFO people need to see the purchase orders that we have created for all the IT equipment, right? So I have this CFO group and I give them access to that library. Good idea or bad idea?
Bad idea.
It's not awful, okay? But when you go and you add that CFO group to your site, you don't go right to that library and add them. You go to the site and you add them. And then you trim away where people are not supposed to have permissions. At the site level, you should give everybody at least read rights that's going to get some level of access. The reason, you have all kinds of scripts, CSS files that are being used to render your content a very nice, pretty way. And if you have only given them access to the library and not the rest of the site, they don't see those scripts that are being called to render your stuff correctly. And things will look weird. Okay? So you give the permissions at the site level, and then you trim away from all the lists and libraries where they're not supposed to have access. That's how you're supposed to do that. Trim the fat. Don't go straight to the list or library and add the group. Add it to the site, and then trim away where it's not supposed to have access.
How do you do that with the, excuse me, if you add them to a group that has read-write access, a group, but they have access to some of the lists, but this person you just added, they shouldn't have access to some of the.
We're not talking about people. We're talking about roles.
Oh, roles. Okay.
Yeah, these are permission groups. The Army claims, Air Force claims, DSS claims. I don't care about people. Really, and stick this in your head hard, okay? You don't give people permissions. You give roles permissions. And then you assign people to different roles. You have to really think about that hard, because all the time you're going to go into somebody's site and you're going to see 50 people listed who have some weird level of access. That is no way to manage anything, especially if you're in charge of managing hundreds of sites. Because lo and behold, so-and-so leaves the organization. Are you really going to go to 50 different sites and remove them? Probably not, right? That's going to be dangerous. So you give the roles the level of rights that they need. And then as people come and go from the organization, you just assign them the roles and you remove them from the roles, 5, 6 tops they might have. When they leave, you go to those 5, 6 roles and you remove them. Done. You don't go site to site to site all over your site collection and add and remove. You go to that one site that I talked about earlier, you find out where they are, you go into them, you delete them. Done. Right? Oh, I'm sorry, I tripped over my own bag. Let's see here. Okay, so inheritance breaks on the item level. How often have you done that? Gone into a single list, and on the list itself you have broken inheritance on single rows. Why are you doing that?
Not on single rows, no.
Okay, I'll tell you, there are some good reasons to do it. But I would say 99% of the time, you should have a workflow that does it. Okay? You have HR files. Everybody in the company gets a file folder. You, as an employee, should have the right to see what the company is maintaining on you. You should have rights to read your own folder, but not everybody else's. HR should be able to see everybody's, right? So how do you properly break inheritance on 100 folders so that you get to see your folder, he gets to see his folder, Matt gets to see his folder, but not everybody else's, right? You can create a new content type based on document set or folder, right? Add a column to it called, account or something like that. And you put in the account of you, and I have a workflow that runs an impersonation step that will then alter the permissions, okay? If you're going to do item level permission breaks, it should be well defined in a workflow what those permission breaks are. It should not be where people are individually clicking and changing those permissions, because you look at the list, there's nothing obvious to tell you permission breaks have been made. You go into a library that has, 1,000 folders, some of them 7 tiers deep, and you're looking at one that's on the 4th tier, someone's broken inheritance. Eek, right? In a library, I would never, on a traditional library, I would never do something like that. But I would do a lot of document sets where I have a workflow that changes the permissions on that document set so that certain people might get the additional ability to read it or something like that. But it's well defined and documented so that that happens that way. There's another reason I will sometimes break inheritance at the item level. Say you have a lookup and you only want certain people to be able to see certain items in that lookup, right? You, as an HR person, you get to see like this column I'm going to have in there called action, right? So on a person that works for the organization, I want to run a certain action on them. The workflow is going to kick off and do something, right? So on change, it's going to look at what's the action, run this step, okay? Well, if I, as the HR person, I get to run 10 different things. You, as the individual, you only get to say, create a new leave request or something like that. So you might only get 2 or 3 things, but the HR people get to see 10 things where they can run all these other things. So that lookup list, you can go there and break the inheritance on those items so that you only get to read the things that are available for you as an option. So that's kind of cool. If you're using some other kind of code or info path, you can have it filter based on all kinds. That's convoluted. I just changed the permission level on the item. It works. So that's that. That is actually everything. So questions to the floor. anyone, anything like you heard me say where you're like, what?
So I was just on your blog looking for this file. Is it on the SharePoint Superheroes site?
Mm-hmm. It's there somewhere. If you don't find it, email me.
All right.
Because I'm always updating this with other things. The worksheet that I use, or this workbook, right? I'll use it to say, like, here's a list that we're building, right? So you get the little drop down to say what kind of column is it. I say what's the internal name and the regular display name. And the reason for this is because I don't want all the funky characters when I'm writing JavaScript. Okay? So you create, if you don't know this yet, when you create columns in a list, you create them with no spaces. You camel case it. Don't use an underscore because that's like hex character 02A. Okay? That's crazy. You don't want to have to type that if you're ever writing code and you want to change things around. So you camel case it. You know, pump, lower, pump, lower, right? Okay? So when you create it with the internal name, then you change it to whatever you want the display name to be. Say the type, you know, I had some other stuff in there because we had some funny things going on. And then we just say, you know, is this required, hidden, or whatever, right? And I would put the different content types that I'm using across here. Sometimes I'm using multiple content types because it's a phased kind of thing from a new to working, the final, or, you know, if we're working with documents, you know, it could be a project plan, the risk management plan, and all these other things that might go into a projects library of sorts, and then, you know, have a funny content type for, you know, your office picnic flyer, right? Where you're not using the same metadata. I also use, let's see here, I've got some other stuff. Oh, this crazy one. Nope. I might have deleted it from this one already. I've got one worksheet where if you haven't used, how do you normally write your calculation for a calculated column? You go right in that little itty box that they give you and parenthesis, if, right? That gets crazy, right? If I were to do this, let's blow this up, I'll make something real quick. So I can say impact, what is it? Probability and risk. Okay? So you have these risk matrices, right? You know, what's the probability versus the impact, and you say high, medium, low, and all that good stuff, right? So the easy way to make that calculation, I now go into this cell, and right here, I'm going to say impact. Okay? Did it work? Impact. How did that not work?
Because the
because
demo destroyer is on the.
I still have the worksheet. I probably just did it. Okay. There we go. That one. Problem. Come on now. Okay, so what you're going to see here is now I can say equals if, boom, impact, right? I can do that. Bigger click. Equals high. And do it, right? Now what you're seeing, I don't know how well you can see it up on that screen. You see the impact is blue and all that stuff?
Mm-hmm.
As you start to make this, your parentheses become purple and green and all that. And now you have IntelliSense. So you're going to be able to figure out where you're missing a parenthesis. You're going to be able to do 95% of the calculations that you can do inside of SharePoint, you do in Excel. So you steal the calculation out of here, and you copy and paste and you stick it in there, right? And because you can name these cells by going up in that corner box and renaming it, you can just do a straight copy and paste. You don't have to go back in there and rename A1, find and replace, and put in the column name that you're actually using. You put in that name, and then you copy paste and stick it in there. Ta-da!
That's awesome.
It is so useful because that itty bitty box that they give you to write that calculation is just too tiny. So you can use the IntelliSense out of a worksheet to build all that stuff for you. Very beautiful. Do it. It just helps because I don't know how many times I've been trying to make a calculation and it says syntax error. Where was that? Right? You build it here, text equals blah, 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 you get all that stuff, and it works. It's a beautiful thing. So, So if you can't find it on the blog, email me, scott.brewster@dansolutions.com or scott@madwhitehatter.com, and I will respond with a blank template that I use for all this stuff that you can use. But yeah, I use this to document everything way before you build it. I can't stress this enough. Document everything before you build it. It's not just because you need to remember what you did 3 months ago whenever someone says, hey, I need this changed. It's so that whenever you leave, whoever comes in behind you doesn't spend the first month bad-mouthing you because they don't understand why you built something a certain way. You document it very, very well. Guess what? No one can say a damn thing about how well you did it because you documented it. Nothing keeps it all cleaner than transparency. Sir.
So I have so I'm dealing with something right now with the client that I have. I just get a headache just thinking about it. So I inherited this site. It has 36,000 documents in one document library, spread out over 10 different folders.
Okay.
And they have permissions spread out. Yeah, that's what gives it a headache. So they have permissions spread out, and these 10 folders are different tasks for different people, and I think it should be in its own document library.
Yes.
So yeah, I just wanted to get your
suggestion.
Yes.
When do you create a new document library? Whenever the permission structure changes, because I don't break it at the folder level unless it's for some highly specialized thing like the HR stuff that I was talking about. Okay. Or yeah, that you create new document libraries whenever the content is vastly different from other document libraries. If this document library needs to have a workflow run on anything, while this one is just for like all of your finished products, So in your situation, if it needs to go from this person to this person to this person in sequence, and you've got like 10 steps, I would have a workflow that runs so that whenever you're done with this step, you click the right piece of metadata and the workflow executes and moves it to the next folder. Or not folder, but new library. I would keep doing that, and I would have the libraries all separated out. Because that's just crazy.
Yeah.
If you index things properly and whatnot, you can have up to 10 million items. That's not the biggest hurdle. But that's just a little nutty because if they have the folders like that, I guarantee you they don't have a workflow that moves them from one to another. They manually pick it up and they drop it into the next one, don't they?
Yeah. There's no metadata, no nothing.
And also,
They just dumped it in the library.
What's that?
Watch out your version.
Oh, what, the permissions or workflows?
Moving it from folder to folder.
Like it should, right?
But I don't move, right? You go into SharePoint disaster and there's a copy action, there is no move action, right? I copy to the next, and then I have some piece of metadata that will, archive, for lack of better words, or hide that one that you're working with, okay? So you can still keep the content that they needed so that they know what they did, but it's just hidden from the future view of everything, and you keep on going. But I would just copy it to the next, because maybe that next person doesn't need to know the 50 iterations it went through before it got to them. You know, maybe I don't want them to see all that sausage making before it gets to their step. You know, and maybe I don't want them to, you know, revert back to version 1, right? Because that would be bad. But, you know, permission-wise, take it from library to library to library to library. Get a SharePoint disaster workflow to run. That's not a hard one to do. But, you know, add some metadata to those things so that, you know, things are running based on the metadata. I can't stress that enough. Every time I see, like one library that I always delete, okay, I create a new site. What does it come with? New calendar. So that's kind of scary, right? You've got 50 sub-organizations, they all have a calendar. Is that really necessary?
No.
Maybe, maybe not. Okay, that's business decision. But every one of these sites comes with a new documents library. Nothing is more vague than a library called documents. Like, why would you ever create a whole other library? You've already got one for all of your documents, right? No, it can get stranger. Shared documents. Well, it's SharePoint. I'm sharing it with other people, right? I've come into environments where I'm seeing a documents library and a shared documents library in the site. And I'm like, which one do I use? I don't know. So when something is named that vague, to me, it means now it is that miscellaneous junk drawer. I delete the documents library out of every single site that I ever create. And I create ones that are more specific for their intended use, named accordingly, right? The other reason is more often than not, I've turned the publishing feature on, and I don't want the extra pieces of metadata that it automatically adds to that default documents library of scheduling, because that gets scary. People don't know how to use it. The other things that people do, they love to create, hey, let me turn on the content organizer, see what that is, right? Now you have a drop-off library that you have no idea how to delete because you have to get someone to stop the timer job in order to do it. That gets crazy, right? So one, never turn on a feature that you don't know what it does exactly. But two, what I've seen, what happens with the drop-off library, people never set up the rules and stuff on it, and they use it like, you know, Dropbox. I'm not kidding. They do this, right? So every decision, every setting you could possibly make should have had a conscious decision behind it.
Just humorous story about Content Organizer, and this is a couple of years ago, and a group of people who were writing a book on SharePoint. These are experts in SharePoint. And like everybody else, they had a site collection in the FEDSPUG site. I was getting ready to re-image the server. They said, oh, don't do that. We're about to go to publishing. I go, wait a minute. What, that part about nothing mission critical or whatever, you know, because we got too many students in here, it gets blown up every couple of months. But a whole group of these folks writing their book, and somebody activated the content organizer, and then I thought, oh, drop-off library. Let's put our chapters over in there, all 38 of them. Because I was using this for a proof of concept for USDA records management. I had the content organizer job set to run every minute. They dropped 38, 40 items in this thing. And with the content organizer, if it doesn't match a rule, it sends an email to the administrator saying there's something in the content to the drop-off library that doesn't match a rule, you need to go in and change it. Well, it did that 40 times every minute from about 9 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning. Literally blew up my Exchange server. It crashed. My Outlook crashed from the multiple thousands of emails on that.
That's what I'm going to do.
Huh?
What you have to do to fix it.
Remove the items out of the content, out of the drop-off library, or have a rule. They had no rules. They didn't know what it was. They just said drop-off library. Okay, that's cool. That's where we'll drop everything. You know, you morons, and you're writing the book on this. So first, be careful with the experts.
Yep, always beware the expert.
Won't. Jonathan Lightfoot did give us a really nice shout out in the forward because all the screenshots are from FEDSPUG, but I won't name the book.
It just dawned on me another pointer I have to throw out there to you. You are in a members group, or your user is in a members group, right? And because the way you've done the permissions, workflow's running. You've got logging statements in the workflow, okay? And it's failing. Where do you go to fix that? What do you think is probably wrong? If it works for you, and you're site, administrator, or you got site clinic admin rights, it's working for you, but not your user. Where do you think the problem is? Your workflow history list. Your workflow history list inherits the permissions of the site. So if you have a particular list where, it's so that everyone can go in and contribute, say, site feedback, right? I wouldn't by default normally give contribute rights to everyone on my site so that they could contribute to every other list and library, right? I give them rights, read because it's everyone and whatnot. But on this one particular list, I want site feedback. And it's failing. It's because you're writing a log to a workflow history log where they only have read rights. So if this happens, you go into SharePoint disaster, you find your workflow history log, you open it into the browser because by default you can't browse directly to it, and you change its permissions. Okay? I've run into that a number of times. People are like, Sky, help me, it keeps breaking, I don't know why. I'm like, I got that. Hero. Yep. Anyway, unless anyone else has specific questions, you're free to hit me up anytime before 10 p.m. on any given day. If you want to call or email me, or tweet me, or whatever.
Okay, no questions from the Skype world. So I'm going to turn off and close down Skype for those on the line.